What's going on, guys? My name's Lior and welcome back to my channel. Now, I've had a lot of people DM me on Instagram and ask me to make some content about multifamily ground up development and the things you need to consider if you're gonna go down that avenue. So what I thought I would do is make this video and I'll talk about a few specific facets of ground up development with multifamily. I'll talk about the permitting process, how I look to structure my deals, as well as the financing component that comes in when you're dealing with ground up projects. So with that, let's get at it. What's going on, guys? My name's Lior and welcome back to my channel. Now, I am a real estate investor right here out of Boston, Mass. And if this is your first time on my channel, first of all, welcome. Second of all, make sure you smash that subscribe button for me. I'm putting out tons of new videos every single week, all about real estate investing, talking about different facets, of buy and holds. I talk about my personal philosophies. I give you guys tours of my projects and thoughts about how to analyze deals and what to do with your own business. So with that, let's get right into the meat and potatoes. And as I said, a lot of you guys have asked me about what are the things you need to look out for on the ground up side on the multifamily development projects. So I've done a couple of these now. We are currently finishing up 2 projects right now that are ground up construction that will be apartments. We're permitting our 3rd one right now. So I'll kind of talk about my experiences and again, some of the key facets you need to consider with ground up. So number one facet that's very different from buying existing buildings when you're looking to potentially develop raw land or knock something down and develop it is permitting, right? And here's the thing you need to understand with permitting, right? Permitting is a completely different beast than when you're going and renovating existing structures, right? Because you're basically dealing with the zoning code for your local city that you're in. Now, a lot of times you need to figure out, based on help with your architects, zoning attorneys, etc., right, what you can actually potentially build on that piece of land. And a lot of times when you're dealing with raw pieces of land, right, is you need to get special approvals from the city, right, in order to be able to build what you want, right? So basically the way it works is different lots are zoned for different purposes, right? So you can have single family lots, you can have like say 2 family zones, 3 family zones, multifamily zones, commercial zones, etc. Now you need to evaluate, understand what could you possibly get on that lot and understand that depending on the city, and you're gonna go through a different type of process through the permitting, right? So in Boston, for example, it's actually quite a bit of a long, complicated, and expensive process where we usually take 6 to 9 months to go through a number of steps, right? We first typically have to propose our plans to the abutters of the property. Then we go to a local community group, and only then do we get in front of the zoning board of appeals, right? And that zoning board of appeals is that committee that works with the city that essentially looks at the proposals and what either accepts them or denies them. Now, different cities have different ways of doing this. I know some cities, even around Boston, that are outside of Boston, are a lot easier. Sometimes you can go, maybe you just need 1 meeting and then you go directly to the zoning board of appeals. But as I said, Boston's a little bit more complicated. But the point is, you need to understand that there's quite a bit of process that goes into permitting a raw piece of land or a knockdown structure, right? So when you're evaluating the deal, this is going to go into the next segment of deal structuring, right? You really need to understand, like, how do you evaluate the risks of what can I potentially get approved on this land versus what I think I can get approved versus what I want to get approved versus what the community and ultimately the zoning board will allow me to approve on here. So now let's this is a good transition to go into deal structuring, right? So now that we kind of have a sense of like, okay, there's obviously some risk up in the air of what I can get approved on a certain raw piece of land, how to use an investor structure a deal where you're kind of protecting yourself from, say, if you thought you could get 4 units approved, all of a sudden you get 2 units approved or only a single family approved, right? And there's a couple of ways to think about this, right? The typical way I usually like to buy land is through what's called a zoning contingency, right? And basically what I tell the seller is, look, I have no idea, right, what the city's gonna approve, right? I have thoughts about what I'm gonna present and what, is reasonable and what I think could get approved, But at the end of the day, the city could say yes, the city could say no, or the community or the abutters could say yes, they could say no. There's just a lot at risk. So instead of closing on your piece of land, I'm essentially I'm asking for a contingency where I can go through this permitting process before closing on the land, and that way I can see exactly what I can get approved on the piece of land. Now, this is of course different than buying the piece of land, quote unquote, as is, right? Because if you're buying the land as is, again, as I talked about in the previous point, you're taking on some inherent risk, right? There's always a chance that something can go wrong during the community process. One of your neighbors can, maybe super opposed to the project. Maybe someone at the zoning board of appeals you get voted against the project, right? So buying the land as is actually quite a bit of risk. So those are kind of the two different ways, at a high level, you can kind of structure the deals. And, when it comes into negotiating with a seller, the way I usually position it is, look, if I'm buying the land as is, I need to get a discount on it, right? Because I'm the one, as the buyer, once I close on it, I'm the one that's going to take the full risk of, hey, anything can get approved on here, right? It could be a home run deal, or it could be a total, something that's going to be a total catastrophic loss, right? And that's 100% on me. So if I'm going to be looking to buy the deal as is, I'm going to be looking for some sort of discount. Now, if I can negotiate a zoning contingency, right? Usually, what the motivation for sellers is they can get premiums on their land, because now I can run. Let's say I have a zoning contingency and I think I can get 3 to 4 or 5 units approved, right? It's a lot easier to pencil out the math and say, hey, this is what I think I can build. You're asking for this price. I can do this price that you're asking for if I can get this amount of units approved on it, right? So now you're kind of managing your risk better. Of course, there's still a chance the city denies you, right? And even if you have that contingency, the city can still ultimately shut down the project. And that I've heard of instances of that happening, right? But at least you don't own the land and you're not completely in the hole, right? You're obviously gonna lose the money that you spent on trying to go through the permitting process, which involves, and I'll talk about it in more detail, but involves costs for architects and zoning attorneys typically, and surveyors. But at least you don't own and you didn't close on that piece of land that now is completely devalued, right? Because, whatever you thought you could build on there just got denied by the city. So hopefully that makes sense so far, right? So just to quickly recap, you want to, when you're dealing with that land, it's really all about risk mitigation of what you can get permitted on there, right? So now let's talk at a high level about some additional costs that you need to think about you're going to incur as you're going to go through this permitting process and ultimately start construction on this ground up project, right? So as I said, for permitting, typically the costs you're going to incur are surveying costs. You're going to have to get things like a survey done, a plot plan. You're going to have architectural plans, right? So you're going to have to hire an architect to draw you up proposed plans for the building that you're proposing on that land. If you're going to do the zoning work yourself, obviously you can do that, but I typically get a zoning attorney, someone that's intimately familiar with the process, knows the people that work through that process. It can kind of help us push the project or proposal along to ultimately get it approved. Now, beyond that, once and if you get approved for that project, before you even start to break ground, you're going to have additional expenses that you're going to have to pay. There's typically additional engineering, right? You're going to have to do a lot of civil and structural engineering. You're going to have mechanical plans. You're going to have to come up with water and sewer design plans and utility plans. Some cities also make you do things like construction management plans, traffic plans, depending on where the parcel is and how that's going to work. So there's a bunch of additional plans that are going to come off as a cost in order to get everything approved from the city and ultimately be able to pull the permit and break ground on the project. Now, let me talk a little bit about financing, because a lot of you guys are probably going to finance your projects just like I do with bank money, right? It's unlikely you're going to do everything cash. So here's the first thing you need to understand is if you're buying land as is, right? And let's say you go to a bank, typically from what I've seen, again, this is just from my experience, most banks have told me if the land is just raw and does not have anything approved by the city for it, most banks are probably going to limit their loan of value on the land at 50%, right? So, if you're buying a piece of land for $300,000, right, you're probably going to be limited to 50% LTV, which means you can only really borrow $150,000, which makes sense, right? Because basically the bank is kind of limiting their exposure. They're limiting the loan that they're offering on that parcel of property because there's obviously still some risk with what exactly can get approved by the city on that piece of land. Now, if you structure your deal with a zoning contingency like I talked about earlier, right? Again, remember, you're not actually closing on the piece of land until you get the permits approved, right? So you only have to close once the city signs off and says, hey, you can go build 2 townhomes or 3 units or 5 units or whatever it is, right? So if you're able to structure a deal that way, then you can actually bring a bank at more quote unquote regular terms, where you can get acquisition financing closer to 75%, right? Loan to value, which is kind of your typical commercial mortgage anyway, right? Because now the banks can evaluate and say, hey, you got 4 units approved, this is what we think it's gonna cost, and they can kind of do the deal analysis much cleaner and much tighter than instead of having a ton of variability. Now, on the construction side, if you're gonna finance the construction through the bank as well, usually the way I structure my deals is we do an acquisition arm plus, of course, the construction arm. A lot of banks certainly can lend up to 100% of the construction cost. I know, some banks are more conservative and will only maybe do 75 or 80% of the construction. So for that, I would just recommend talking to a number of lenders and seeing what kind of suits you best. You can also talk to them whether they're willing to finance any soft costs or interest reserve costs. This goes the same for any other construction projects. You just got to talk to lenders and see what they're willing to do and what's important for you, right? Because ultimately, you need to figure out what's the best way to structure your deal and where your cash sources are coming from. So if you need to finance, if you can get that finance, that's great. If not, obviously you just have to plan to pay for all of those additional costs as cash out of pocket. So hopefully that kind of helped. As I said, I mean, once you get into the ground up development game, it is certainly a little different than buying existing buildings and renovating them, right? There's a lot more risk. There's a lot more to do with the city and the permitting side of it. There's a lot more cost to it as well, right? Because now, again, I mean, you're putting up a brand new structure. You got to deal with everything, right? The engineer, as I talked about, you got the additional engineering costs, mechanical costs, utility costs, et cetera, et cetera. So there's certainly a lot more to it. Now, of course, typically new construction projects have a lot of meat on the bone, which is why people go after them. But I would strongly say if you've never done one, what I did on my first one, as I've done with a lot of first initiatives, is partner with someone that has a much better understanding of the process than I do. That's certainly probably the best way to really, learn, do the project, and mitigate your risk at the same time. So I know I went through a lot, but if you guys have any questions about any of this, make sure to hit me up on the comments below or go on my Instagram, and happy to help you out.